All right. Well, welcome back to the Hildebrand Project Summer Seminar for our afternoon sessions. And we're going to start off this afternoon with a session on personalism in the modern era and thinking about personalism in relation to modern thinking and personalism as a developing and living tradition in our own times. We have two fine speakers with us today. Our first speaker will be David Walsh. David is professor of politics at the Catholic University of America, and his most recent works include The Politics of the Person as the Politics of Being, fine work, highly recommended, and The Priority of the Person, also highly recommended. So we'll hear from Professor Walsh first, and then we will hear from Rocco Buttiglione, whom we have heard from before. He is professor of political science at the Pius V University in Rome, and he's a member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, and he was a friend of John Paul II. He previously taught at numerous other institutions, including the great personalist stronghold, the International Academy of Philosophy in Liechtenstein. So we'll do this just as we've done previous sessions. We'll hear from our two speakers, and while they are speaking, I highly encourage you to put questions in the question and answer box or in the chat, and we'll take plenty of time to answer those questions at the end of the session. David?
All right. Thanks very much, Mark, and thank you to the Hildebrand Project for the kind invitation. I've known about the project for many years, but haven't had an opportunity to interact with many of the people involved in it. You know, I'm probably, I feel as if I'm coming to a dinner here where everybody has cooked their great dishes, and I'm really kind of a guy just carrying a sandwich. So it's a great pleasure to be. I really thoroughly enjoyed all of the sessions I've followed during the week, and I think it's a marvelous work and a marvelous way of bringing in a lot of like-minded people, especially young people. And I especially enjoyed the sessions with the younger people. Amanda Eichmann I knew before, and Shannon too. Lovely to have those that great mixture of things, and so and it's certainly in tune with the spirit of personalism and the personalist approach. So it's I really want to applaud all of that, and thanks to John Henry and the organizers. My work, I basically approach this from political theory, and I know most of you are either in philosophy, theology, or something related to that. So political theorists are dilettantes. They dabble in things, but that's the way in which politics itself unfolds. In politics, we can't really wait for philosophers to solve questions. We have to just go ahead with the intuitions that we have and the way in which we've managed to organize things. And you know, if I was asked to comment on personalism in the modern world, I would say that really the differentiation of the person is one of the major achievements of modern civilization and modern intellectual and political history. And those are two quite independent streams. I think, you know, we have been talking about it from a largely philosophical, theological perspective, but the discovery of the person or the priority of the person is something that really emerges much more noticeably within the political arena. And hopefully tomorrow when I have a chance to talk about politics, I'll make that the focus. But it's worth keeping in mind that the discovery of the person is not just a philosophical and theological event, it's also a political event. And that's as you would expect, because when philosophers and theologians reflect on what's happening, there's already a world out there that's done its own reflection and articulated itself in some way, in some fashion or another. And so it's not too surprising to find convergences. On the philosophical side, I think we've had some wonderful discussions, commentaries, and observations about the emergence of personalism as a philosophical movement. I'm not sure that that's 100% accurate. It seemed, again, I'm only an outsider, so you have to keep all my remarks in that kind of context, that I'm just a pure dilettante. Personalism seems to be a kind of diffuse event, or a diffuse pattern of things, and you can find personalist streams and you can pull them together from many different sources. In fact, I would recommend that people look at the essay or the article in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy on personalism by Yang Olaf Bengtsson. He did a book on it, but thankfully he condensed it all into a nice long article in the Stanford Encyclopedia. And it's a great overview because he shows you, for instance, that there are many different streams of it, and that especially there's a wholly independent American version of it. And that indeed the term personalism occurs first with the German idealists. Friedrich Schleiermacher seems to be the first person to use it. But astonishingly, Walt Whitman uses it in about 1865 or so in an article in the Mercury or some literary journal. So it's, it pops up in surprising ways. And even though we're thinking largely in terms of a Catholic strand of personalism, obviously it overflows those boundaries, and it's worth keeping in mind. Now, it's not also clear to me that, before I go on to talk about the person as such, let me also make a general observation about how we as personalists have a very, very like-minded approach, might think about that sort of larger field of fellow travelers who are working on the notion of the person and are helpful and useful and so on. Immanuel Kant has come up for some, significant laudatory remarks, but there's much more in Kant than that, and he's generally, most of those remarks are generally qualified by various criticisms of Kant too. I'm not really interested in kind of adding up the pluses and minuses, the negatives and positives, so much as trying to understand how a person like Kant, tries to sort out the issues, not whether he gets it all right, but how he manages to do it. And so in that sense, I would, I'd keep an open mind on many things until we've really looked at them. And I would, include it all the way up to 20th century philosophy and contemporary philosophy too. I mean, someone like Thomas Nagel and Roger Scruton, from very different philosophical traditions, show you that really personalism is alive and well. Now, of course, I don't, in these other neighborhoods, I wouldn't, I'm not 100% comfortable with the term personalism either. Because isms are suspect. They're a suspect use of language, because when you put an ism at the end of something, you basically say, oh, I'm going to close that box and assume that I know everything that's inside. But it's not necessarily the case. The fact that we don't have a great label for it may be, a positive as well as a negative. It's interesting if we look further back and think about the emergence or the differentiation of the notion of the person, that really, even though you could say all of the elements are there from ancient philosophy, and I think, Mark, you were the one who told us about the Heraclitus stuff, and the pre-Socratic side of it. So it's yes, it's all there. The discovery of mind, that text by Bruno Snell, and anybody who, obviously something unique happens in Greek philosophy, and it happens in the the Israelite revelation, and as it happens in other places too, that the individual is discovered, and if not consciousness, at least mind is discovered, nous, all of those things. And it is striking that the term person does not emerge there, even though they have the word, the prosopon, the mask, the character, what's presented. Yes, that's kind of the linguistic beginning of it, but it's a linguistic beginning that doesn't really it doesn't really get elaborated or developed. So it's not part of classical philosophy in any really kind of robust way. It's deeper there in the Christian writings, in the New Testament, and in the early church, the church fathers, and of course, particularly in St. Augustine and others. Augustine in the Confessions, almost invents the whole field of the interiority of the person. Whenever I teach the Confessions, I always explain, look, this is where all novels come from. This is where all discussions of the interior self-expression and everything else, the focus on the self. Even that certainly is there, but even that doesn't get fully, I could say, clarified. Augustine himself seems to be somewhat dissatisfied with the state in which his account of the person is left. And then the scholastics have their own limits. St. Thomas has a wonderful account of the person in relation to the Trinity, but very little on the person in relation to human persons. You could say this long train of thinking about persons really hasn't really emerged above the ground. It's like a submarine. It's under the water, and there's the periscope is up there, but it hasn't surfaced. So the surfacing of the person is something that's really left to us moderns. And yes, Descartes does kind of a clumsy job of it, and John Locke isn't any better, and Thomas Hobbes makes a hames of it, but they're all actually dealing with the person, and they all account for the person in one way or another. And then Kant and German idealism, and then we're off to the races. But a great personalist like Søren Kierkegaard is hardly ever mentioned as the sort of culminating figure within all of this. So it's a complicated enough field. And all I'm doing is throwing all that out there. And I know that the students and others who are on the call are all thinking in your own ways about it, and you have a certain set of texts in mind. All I'm saying is be ready to broaden it out. And I think many of the best sessions have called us into the notion of narrative, of personal encounter, of those moments in which we find out what persons are by our interactions with one another. And in fact, that seems to be the case. Now, there is one amazing sort of moment in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where he's talking about friendship, in which we begin to there's a little opening glimpse of what's possible, where he says that in thinking about he says, the reason I like to spend time with my friend is because it enhances my own awareness of myself. And he has an amazing word, sunesthesis, where he says that we reach that point where I become conscious of my own existence and conscious of my friend's existence, and vice versa. So it's an opening of what we would call mutuality, joint perception. That lies outside, that's the point at which we know one another as persons, as beings in ourselves, not about information, about an exchange of anything, a contract or anything else, but just simply knowing one another as persons. I know you usually have this meeting in person, and so, there's a great sort of hunger out there for us to get together as persons as well, and that is all driven by the same dynamic, that it's a much more actualizing moment when we meet one another as persons. I will just close with two illustrations, two amazing illustrations of this. One is the famous case of Helen Keller. Helen Keller was an American child around the turn of the 20th century who at 2 years old was afflicted by a disease that deprived her of hearing and sight, very, very young, at a very early age. So she never learned to hear or to talk. It was only later, as a 10 or 11 years old or so on, that she was one of her teacher, in this case a teacher from Ireland, Anne Sullivan, came over and worked with her, and there's a kind of breakthrough moment. If you go to YouTube, you can find this, because there's a famous movie called The Miracle Worker, and you can just Google or search for the water scene. There's an amazing moment where there's a little fight at the dinner table. Everybody rushes out into the backyard, and the teacher, Anne Sullivan, takes Helen over, puts her under the pump, and pumps the water like this. And she's signing W-A-T-E-R constantly, W-A-T-E-R, W-A-T-E-R. And eventually Helen says, water. There's a huge breakthrough moment in which she understands what the teacher is trying to teach her and what she's been trying to teach her all along. And you can say all of that occurs only because that's the point at which Helen, the little child, grasps what's going on in the mind of the teacher. So there's that moment of pure joint perception there. One person knowing what's happening inside of another person in the interiority of the other. That's what makes it a breakthrough, and that's what makes all breakthroughs possible in terms of communication with one another as persons. I don't want to go on too long, but the last example I want people to think of is this wonderful movie that came out a couple of years ago called A Hidden Life. I don't know if anybody has discussed it, but it's the famous case of Franz Jägerstätter, the one Austrian who refused to serve in Hitler's army and for his pains was arrested and eventually tried and executed. And it's a wonderful movie in which, by the American director Terrence Malick, just beautifully made. Franz and his wife, Fanny, are farmers in the Alps. He reaches this realization that Nazism and the entire project of the Nazi regime and expansion and so on is evil, and that he cannot cooperate with it. And of course, he goes to the bishop, he goes to the priest and the bishop, and they say, oh, carry on with your own business. This is not something that you should be thinking about. But it's a wonderful example of the way in which one person can make all the difference. And none of it, he's not, in fact, he doesn't change anything. He doesn't stop the war. He doesn't change anybody's minds. And everybody says this is not going to have any impact. But gradually, it of course does. And so you see that it's possible for that one of the things that really defines a person is the ability to take your entire life and just make a gift of it and sacrifice it for what is right and what is good. And that makes the difference. And the title of the movie is A Hidden Life, and it comes from a line from a novel called George Eliot. It doesn't come from Jägerstätter or anything else, but that the good that's done in a hidden life can make all of the difference in the world. All right, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, David. That very helpful set of reflections. And now we will turn to Rocco Buttiglione.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Very thoughtful. So the issue is, what is personalism today? And I want to draw your attention to the different threats under which personalism today stands. In the beginning of the Western civilization, we have one man, Socrates. Socrates does not discover the person. I agree with David, that would be too much. But nevertheless, Socrates makes a great discovery. It is the discovery of the subject. The subject is the bearer of moral responsibility. Hegel has a very strong, powerful description of the way in which the world of the ancients is a world in which there are no subjects. The subject is the collective subject. The subject is not the individual man, but the collective group to which he belongs. People live together. They have not a private space. In order to be a subject, you need a little bit of aloneness, a space of yourself in which you can gather and in which you can think about what you think. In the ancient world, you don't think about what you think. You think, and what you think comes immediately out of your mouth and is communicated to the group in which you are. And it becomes a common property. And you don't really know if this is what I thought or what another one of the group thought. There is a common kind of functioning of human thought. You are just a member of the group, a part of the human substance. And then Socrates discovered that no, it is exactly the same example as that of Jägerstätter. We had with Nazism a great retrocession of human spirit, to a pre-Western moment, to a barbarian moment, a moment before the Greek and Roman and Christian civilization. With Socrates, Socrates knows that he has a conscience and he must answer for what he does to an instance that is radicated in him and only in him. It is the daimon who is living in my interiority. He thinks about what he thinks. In Hegel, there's the difference between conscience, human beings are always conscient, Bewusstsein in German, and Selbstbewusstsein, self-consciousness. I am aware of the fact that I am a subject and I carry a responsibility as a subject. That was a great discovery. Is that the person? Yes and no. To have the idea of the person, you need something else that is added by the Christians. And it's something else. And the Christians, on one hand, they refine this discovery of Socrates. Think of the definition of the person of St. Thomas Aquinas. Persona est individualis naturae, no, rationalis naturae, individua substantia. An individual substance of a rational nature. I can think for myself. And when I think, I must also be a master of myself. What is the great addition of Christianity? The person is an hypostasis. Hypostasis is a relation. St. Thomas Aquinas has a magnificent philosophy of the person. Only it is not in his philosophy, it is in his theology. David made an appropriate mention of this. When Thomas describes the relationship of the persons within God, then the relation is strongly characterized as something that pertains essentially to the human being, to the subject. When he speaks about the human subject, a little bit less. It is clear that men are persons, but it is not developed with the same fullness as it is in the case of God's personality. And I think that the great addition that is given by Christianity is exactly, and that is developed later in realist phenomenology, and especially in Wojtyła, is this perception of the person as relation. And the person is relation, okay. The person is a subject, okay. The person is something that cannot be reduced to its body, okay. Now we have a tremendous danger. we may call this a misunderstood Platonism, a kind of misunderstood Platonism that affects our society today. The misunderstood Platonism says that, well, the person has only an accidental link to the body. And the person is not connected with the body and is not connected with human society. The person is in and for itself or herself. Take one example. Take the issues today on the gender identity. What is the content, or this is the philosophical presupposition of what we might call the gender ideology? I am what I decide to be. That is, my subjectivity is pure self-creativity. I do not coincide with my body. I do not coincide with the community in which I grow. I stand for myself and I define myself. Here, a great contribution of realist phenomenology was to point out that the person has an objective structure. Man is not just an object of the world as animals or trees or plants or stones, but nevertheless, man is also an object of this world. And as an object of this world, man has a structure. And the spirit, or the psyche, it's better here to use the Greek word because spirit could be reserved for something different. The psyche has an inner structure, and this structure is linked to the body, so that my body is given to me as something that I have to interpret and to understand. And I can develop the subjectivity that is given to me through my body in many different ways. But nevertheless, I cannot set it aside and imagine for myself something completely different. If I have received one sexuality, one sex, then I have the task of becoming conscious of the meaning of this sex. And I cannot imagine that I could have another one, because this is not true. The objective structure of the person is linked with the body on the one hand, and on the other hand, with the relations I have to others. Let us say, the discovery of Wojtyła, but not only of Wojtyła. Here I think of other authors that deserve to be considered in this connection, like Paul Ricoeur, Levinas, Marion, Jean-Luc Marion, the discovery that I am in relation with others. But this relation is no more the indifferentiated relation that we had in the barbarian times before the Greeks discovered the spirit. It is a differentiated relation. I enter into relation without losing in the relation my identity. Again, you see how prototypical for all this is the Christian idea of the Trinity. Now, we have stand under the danger of losing this synthesis. In our society, there is a dominating trend that tells you that you are not what you are, but what you imagine that you are. And this is developed in a kind of virtual reality in which you can play the role of being somebody else, and you invest in this virtual reality much more energy than the energy you invest in your real life. Think of how many girls and young men see themselves as the imitation of a star of the show business. And they invest in this imitation, the energy. They do not invest in their real life. There is one first and fundamental problem. The idea that conscience is creative without accepting the fundamental presupposition of accepting her own being before developing it creatively. Before I develop my being creatively, and I choose to become a philosopher or a policeman and a lawyer or a physician, before all this, I have to accept what I am. And I have to work with the potentialities that are given to me and are constitutive of my own identity. I think there is one first great cultural challenge to personalism today. And this comes from within personalism, because many of these people would say that they are personalists in the sense that they accept the person. They can talk and tell very beautiful things, also many very truthful things about the person. And nevertheless, they miss this fundamental point. If we accept the fact that we have a body, we must accept the fact that we have an history. Because my body is given to me, not all at once, but in successive stages. And I have to grow together with my body. And my possibility of growing is linked to the people around me. In other words, I have a body because I have a father and a mother. And I cannot understand myself out of the relation with that original reality. It is my own family. You know that I am a great admirer of Sigmund Freud. He was so genial, he almost deserved to be a Catholic, because he rediscovers exactly this structure of the human person. You live in the relation, not in the indifferentiated relation to all human beings, in differentiated relations, begin with your father and mother and continuing with your brothers and sisters, the women you get married with, your children, your friends, your nation, humanity. They are concentrical circles. We run the risk of losing this complex set of relations and of imagining an abstract personality that is what she decides to be, whatever it is. I can even decide to become a part of a machine, of accepting parts of machines within myself. I can put my nervous system directly in connection with a set of machines. Think of all what is going on in the field of transhumanism. Making of my identity and my vocation, my personal vocation, something of which I do not become conscious. I am conscious, but I'm not self-conscious, conscious of myself. There is one first set of problems. A second set of problems arises out of the fact that we enter into an age of humankind in which new peoples enter into history. People who do not have this history, people who do not know about Plato, about Socrates, and very often not even about Jesus Christ. And this, and they have to enter into world history, proposing their own cultures. Can we speak with these people, finding a common personalistic ground? It is difficult. Very often they have a cultural heritage that is not focused on the person. Sometimes they have. Sometimes they have. Some of them have. I think of Rabindranath Tagore, the great Indian poet. Well, he is a personalist. We should devote more attention to these attempts to introduce personalism without other cultures. On the other hand, all human beings, in principle, are accessible to human dialogue. And then I think this is another set of problems for personalism today. On the one hand, the danger of the dissolution of personalism from within. On the other hand, the danger coming from personalism from without. The most apparent form of this danger is Islam. So the problem of a dialogue with Islam on the person, a dialogue on the person, that is on God and on man. Very often we'll listen to dialogues between Islamists and Christians in which, well, the content is how beautiful dialogue is it in itself. But dialogue must have a content. And after I tell you that I find that you are sympathetic, then we must start to talking about things, about the world, about God, about you, and about me. So here's another set of problems that stand in front of us. A third set of problems is connected to what we may call, and I arrive to my conclusion because I've been talking too much, is what we might call postmodernism. Postmodernism, on the one hand, accepts our criticism of immanentist philosophy. Man cannot be man without God. But there is no God, and there is also no man. Man is just a provisional balance of contradictory instincts and passions. Man is just a prosopon. Person is reduced to prosopon. This is an image. I try to project in front of you a certain image of myself. I play a role in front of you, and I play different roles in society. I'm a professor, I am a citizen, I am a father, a mother, whatever. But in all these roles, there is also my compulsory reaction to social pressure that demands of me that I act in conformity with the demand of the broader society. And then what is freedom? Freedom is not in the capacity to invest in the roles, my interiority, because I do not have an interiority. Freedom is just to set aside all these compulsions and to let these things emerge freely. Think of the way in which so many people live today. They work 8 hours in a day, and then the happiness, the manifestation of their inner self is to drink good booze and to dance at the sound of the music that does not bring to unity their passions, but just allows them to express themselves without any container. We should meditate wonderful pages of Plato on music. No city that has bad music can have good politics. And I stop here.
Thank you, Rocco. Very provocative ending point there. And thank you for all those remarks to both of you. I encourage everybody to enter questions in the question and answer box. Or if you want, you can just indicate there that you have a question, and I can ask you to turn on your microphone and allow you to talk, and you can pose your question yourself. Since we have a smaller group here, I think it'll be feasible for everyone who has a question to do so out loud. So I want to, I'll start with the first question that was asked. Greg Saleh, I'm going to allow you to talk and you can ask a question.
Okay. Well, I was really struck by the reading that was suggested for this section. And I saw it as, to me, it seemed like a meditation on Christ's words that what you do to the least of these, you do to me. It was just a statement of the value of the person framed through rights, the concept of rights. And I was just curious. It's not a way of framing it that I've come across in my other readings about personalism. It stood out to me as kind of unique. And I was wondering, does this way of looking at things have its own kind of theoretical pedigree? What were the influences that led you to this way of looking at things and framing it?
Okay, well, let me take a shot at that. Thanks for the question. It's a very thoughtful one, and there are many things that go into. I worked a great deal on liberal political thought and the kind of political theory that goes into liberal democracy and the liberal language of rights. And so it's been a long-term challenge, I think. I mean, to find a way of grounding, you could say, respect for the rights and dignity of each person in a publicly, politically accessible way. It's fine to say that we're all made in the image of God, but not everybody will subscribe to that kind of language. And so in terms of what's viable, in terms of the public square, I think you have to find a way of making it evocative to people who do not have the same theological or faith dispositions that we might all bring to it. And so that's largely been my project, is to find a way of doing that. As I work through the major liberal thinkers, historical and contemporary, I must say I didn't find a lot that was terribly useful. They more or less despair of justifying the language of rights and dignity that we publicly respect and observe as best we can in the kind of societies that we're in. And yet we go on, so it's really one of those cases where, in fact, the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a classic case of it. They said, these are the rights that we agree on, so long as nobody asks us to explain why. So it's a great confession of, I wouldn't say ignorance, but silence and incapacity, philosophical incapacity, let's put it that way. I was very taken by John Rawls, for instance. His senior thesis was published about 12 years ago, in which, that was when he was a Christian. He was about a 22-year-old undergraduate at Princeton, and he wrote a senior thesis on, with the title of it was A Brief Inquiry into the Meaning of Sin and Faith. And the whole project was to show that sin is basically a failure to regard others as persons and to regard them as centers of community. And that faith is the faith to sustain that endeavor. So it was a very theological way into what you might regard as standard liberal principles of individual rights and dignity. And it was, Rawls also published his, was published with that. If you look up that book, there's a little piece at the end called On My Religion, where Rawls explains how he lost his faith. And part of it was going through the war and other things. But, this happens. And in some ways, Rawls is emblematic of the kind of societies that we live in, where we've lost our faith in the very principles that underpin our lives together. And so it was an effort to really dig down, and I think returning to a deeper reverence for the person is one of the ways in which you could resurrect that. Rawls's own personalism was of a Christian kind, and I think it's still embedded in his even mature work after, you could say, in his agnostic phase. I wouldn't say he ever became an atheist, but a secularist. He was definitely a secularist, but a secularist with all of these theological personalist resonances. And I think, he's representative in many ways. I think that's a large part of what sustains things, because everybody, we all know one another as persons. We know what a person is, and so we have all kinds of expectations. If we're going to have a conversation, we have to have a certain sense of the rights that each person in the conversation has. So that's kind of the way into it, and the book kind of culminates in the political, but it goes through a few other permutations before that. But thank you.
Thank you very much.
Muted, sorry. Next, let's go to Deborah Savage. Should be able to talk now. Deborah? You can unmute yourself. Maybe she's not with us. Well, we'll return to her.
Hello.
Oh, there you are. Okay, great. Go ahead.
I don't remember putting a question in. So I heard my name and I.
Sorry, you had
That's
raised your
okay.
hand, so that's
I did. Oh, I have my phone in my pocket.
Oh, that's
anyway, nice to talk to everyone. But I'll come
Okay.
up with one though, but just don't have one right now. Okay.
Okay.
Bye.
Let's see. Let's next go to Mila. I'm sorry about your last. I'm sorry. I'm going to mispronounce your last name, Shachina. I'm going to unmute you here. So I find your name. Sorry about mispronouncing your last name. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you so much. No, that's fine. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we
Okay,
can.
great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the whole conference so far and all the speakers. Professor Buttiglione, I would like you to just, I'm fascinated by the topic of dialogue, especially maybe a personalist understanding of dialogue. I know you mentioned that Tishner speaks about dialogue, and obviously Karol Wojtyła does as well. And I've seen other sessions where you expand on this idea of dialogue, and I just wanted to know, what do you think is a good Christian approach, a Christian personalist approach to the idea of dialogue, and when it comes to not just evangelization, but just coming to the truth of things?
Well, thank you for quoting Tishner. I was a great friend of Tishner. He died very young, but he was a great philosopher. And by the way, he taught me that truth is always simple. He said the mass for the children in Krakow, and all the intellectuals of the city were at that mass. And what he said was meaningful for the children, but also for the intellectuals. If I should give you a model of dialogue, I invite you to reread Moby Dick. Have you read Moby Dick? I hope so.
Yes, I have, but it's very scary. But anyway.
Well, think at the beginning. At the beginning, Ishmael goes to that kind of hotel, and they don't have a room for him. And then they ask him, will you share a room with somebody else? And he says, yes, why not? He goes in the room and he's forced asleep. And after a while, there is another man in the room, and they sleep in the same bed on the two sides of the bed. And after the morning, they both wake up, and the other man is a savage coming from Papuasia. And the immediate reaction of Ismail is a reaction of fear. There is a cannibal. He will eat me, kill me and eat me. And what is the first thing that he does? He shows to Kikeg, that's the name of the Papuasian, I am ready to defend myself, but I am not willing to bring you any damage. I am not threatening you, but I'm willing to defend myself. That's the beginning of dialogue. I have something, I am, and you are, and I don't want to destroy you. I want just to be respected, and I am ready to respect you. And then they start developing a language of signs, as if they both were without language. Really, they have not a common language. And from this working on the common humanity and on the usual facts of everyday life, they become the best friends of the world. So I think these are some fundamental features of dialogue. I respect you. I want from you some things, and I'm ready to give you something in exchange for what I want from you. And I am willing to work together with you for a common purpose. Another model of dialogue, I think, you can find, if professors like to give bibliography. So after Moby Dick, I am thinking to Gaston Fessard, by the way, is one of the authors most cherished by Pope Francis. Fessard says, well, you all have a model, we all have a model of the encounter between man and man. And that model is not the model of dialogue. It is the phenomenology of the spirit of Hegel that is repeated by Jean-Paul Sartre in La critique de la raison dialectique. There are two men, and each man looks to the world, and the world is made of objects. And I affirm my subjectivity, affirming that I am the master of the world of objects. I can and I will impose my will on the objects. And then I see that while you cannot have two masters in this world, one of them must win and the other one must lose and become the servant. It is the dialectics of master and servant. Gaston Fessard says there is not an only kind of dialectics. There is another dialectics. It is the dialectics of men and women. If the other is not another man, another hero, as in the confrontation of the heroes in the epic Greek poetry, if the other is a woman, then you enter into a process that is much more similar to that of Kikeg and Ismail. I am fascinated by her, but I do not want to impose myself to her. I want to win her love. I want her to smile to me. And this is the beginning of the interpersonal relation. I must first recognize her and respect her as a person, and then perhaps I can court her. And perhaps she will say yes, perhaps she will say no. A story can begin. So I think the method of dialogue is the recognition of the other and the conviction, the deep conviction that the other has a conscience. I shall give a third example. It is a political example. Think of Solidarność. Oh, I see now your name. Perhaps you are Polish. You know the story of Solidarność.
Yes, I am. Yes.
Well, in the story of Solidarność, it was a struggle without violence, making an appeal to the conscience of the other, based upon the conviction that the other has a conscience. And you make this appeal, and in the beginning, this appeal is rejected. And Jaruzelski, arrested 60,000 people and brought them to concentration camps and repressed any kind of reaction. And then a story began of a struggle in which the people tried always not to not to accept the violence, not to be submissive to the violence, but nevertheless not to make use of violence, making an appeal to the conscience of the other. Because in order to exercise violence, the other, the bad guy, must be convinced that you are threatening him. If you are not threatening him, then it will be more and more difficult for him to exercise violence. It lasted 10 years. 10 terrible, well, 8 really, 8 terrible years. But in the end, we all discovered that the communists had a conscience. I remember once I told to St. John Paul II, Holiness, you make an appeal to conscience, but communists have no conscience. He laughed and he said, well, we are in the hands of God. We will see what happens. But Jesus Christ tells us that all men have consciences. In the end, it turned out that Jaruzelski had a conscience, and the communists too. That's the method of dialogue.
David, would you like to add anything on this question?
I'll just add very briefly on it, since there might be a few other questions, that I absolutely agree that everyone has a conscience. Now, even in an age of ideology, the very existence of an ideological, you could say, agenda or anything else is usually to conceal or justify what in one's own conscience one is not so happy with, one is not so comfortable with. Ideology is an attempt to repress conscience. And so the real nature of dialogue in all of these cases is to break through to the person who is beyond the ideological exterior. Once you reach the person, ideological differences can be resolved. And I think that may be kind of part of where some of the other questions are going. I'm not sure. Anyway.
Well, thank you.
It takes time. You must know that to enter in a real dialogue with somebody else, it takes time. It may be the time of a whole life, but it is worthwhile for one person.
Well, I want to thank our panelists, David and Rocco, and thanks to all of you who asked questions. I know there were a number of questions still left over. Unfortunately, our time has come to an end. We'll start with the next session in just a couple of minutes, which will be on personalism and counseling and psychology. So look forward to seeing all of you there.